right, welcome to our first episode of Startup Fuckups. Today we have Alastair Smith to speak on fundraising fuck-ups, an interesting topic that I'm sure a lot of entrepreneurs are curious about. Fundraising and raising capital from investors seems like a mythical topic to a lot of entrepreneurs who've never gone through the process of putting themselves out there, speaking to investors. So I think we'll be able to learn a lot of interesting insights today. Alastair, thank you so much for taking the time to be with us today.
Hey, Chin, thank you. This is going to be fun.
Great. Maybe why don't we open up with a quick intro of you? Tell us a bit about Proskida. Tell us about yourself.
Sure. Yeah. So my name's Alastair Smith. I started Proskida, I think we're almost 6 years ago, so quite a while ago. We had built it initially for the massive sport of cross-country skiing. We were trying to bring a type of force measurement and sort of power measurement to cross-country skiing. And then since then, we've evolved quite a bit from primarily hardware to almost entirely software with some sensors and so on, but still in the sport field. We still have some customers in cross-country skiing, but we've since evolved at this stage to alpine skiing and are transitioning into cycling and running, into those big sports. So yeah, I'm based in Whitehorse, Yukon, which is kind of a bit of a different sort of location. And when we talk a lot about sort of the fundraising stuff, it's, I think some of the stuff that we deal with being remote, and remote being, quite frankly, anywhere that's not, a major urban center. You could be in Revelstoke, you could be in whatever, it's like Barrie, Ontario. It's ultimately, if you're not within just sort of just the front door of somebody, it can be a bit of a challenge for sure.
Maybe before we jump into fundraising, tell me a bit more about kind of what motivates you, what are your values, and kind of what was your mission with Proskida when you started it?
Sure, yeah. The big thing for me is I've always enjoyed building things and making things. And I think the thing is ultimately is like, how can, you make an impact? And I think that's, my guess is probably what most people want in their life, is to have some sort of sense of meaning. And for me, part of that is, building a company, building a product, being able to see how that product can change someone's life for the better, ideally.
Mm-hmm.
That's probably the primary motivation for me. Sport has always been high on there because just sport itself has such such positive impacts, or it can, for an individual. Certainly at elite sport, that's where things start to maybe get a little more gray, but certainly are murky. But for those of us who are out and exercising and kind of, it just, the endorphins, it makes us feel better. We get it often can be outside if you're, depending of course on the sport. So it's nice to be able to be in an industry that A, I enjoy, and B, has on its own just a positive impact. So, that paired with making something that can help people, I feel like is kind of a win-win.
Yeah, thanks for sharing. I totally agree with that sentiment around wanting to make some sort of impactful change, because what I've seen is the entrepreneurs that I've worked with in the past, the ones who go into business for bigger reasons than just about the money, tend to last a lot longer and tend to see a bit more success as well. So good to hear that.
Yeah.
Maybe I'm curious to hear as well, what are your personal values? And I'd like to ask this question because the way I see it, I believe that a lot of decision making comes from us trying to evaluate, what are the benefits, what are the drawbacks of any sort of decision that we make. So what oftentimes I find a lot of people don't realize is that pros and cons stem from personal values. My pros and cons might be very different from your pros and cons. So what are your personal values? How do you kind of make your decisions based on those values?
Yeah, it's an interesting one. I'm trying to think, how introspective I can be on this, and there's certainly this feeling like mutual respect is a huge one for me. So this element of, where it'll come down to, we talk a little bit about it, but is again the value for that customer is that like whatever I'm doing, I'm hoping that I respect the customer, I respect the person that we're making this for. So that's kind of a really big thing for me. It's not about just like, oh, I hope they make it and then I run away and there's no support and no value on that. Um, Similarly, that trait kind of goes towards on the investor side. And there's, those things in terms of decision making has been, it's been pretty fundamental in the process of making decisions. Like we've always been very much the product first kind of company, which has not always probably been the absolute best approach. As I look in hindsight, I realize that could have been times where we may we may have been focusing, a little bit like the Xerox Parks scenario, where it's like, okay, yeah, you can make the world's best product, but if people don't really know about it, then it's not going to be the world's best product. Because ultimately, it's the impact that product can make, and if you're not out there, then that's not a big thing. So, but ultimately for us, it was always about this integrity in the product itself. Is that what we didn't want to do was put something out that was a sham. Because again, in the industry that we're in sport, and we're selling, this idea of performance gain. I don't want to say performance enhancement because that often has a connotation with illicit sort of Tour de France back in the sort of 2000s. But it's about gain and how can we help someone who wants to get better, how can we help them get better? So again, there's that respect side of things. And then where that plays out on the investor side is it's very much, we have people who have invested in me, in our company, and who have trusted me to take this to, where I said it was going to go. And so that's been a really big part too, is again, on that sort of decision making sort of, when it comes time to it, is you're looking, going, okay, well, is this still kind of going, of course, in the direction we want to? And yeah, ultimately, it's kind of, I'd say it's that integrity. You want to be able to be honest. There's no bullshitting. I hate that. I hate bullshitting so much. So it's, that's where I find also it can be tough, because I think my general sort of take on things is more on the engineer side of things, or this often can be kind of the academic, where you don't like to say things in sort of absolutes. You're often couching stuff, your statements, because you don't entirely know. Like no one can be absolute in any of their statements. So, but of course, the problem with that is often when you're trying to sell something, or to like, be it an investment into your business, or be it your product, sometimes you kind of don't. It's not really a good idea to introduce some ambiguity at that stage. You kind of want to be like, oh no, optimistic. Of course, it's going to be awesome. Hockey stick curve, blah blah blah. Rather than like, no, it could fail. It's a risk. We don't really know. And the people who've invested in me, and again, a lot of the customers, especially our early customers, I think appreciated that. So, which has been good. But I think, as you say, there's the plus sides and the negatives, pluses and negatives for sure.
Yeah, no, thanks for sharing that. I think it's I find that it's almost a misconception that a lot of early entrepreneurs tend to have as well when it comes to the approach, when it comes to getting in front of investors. I often hear that a lot of entrepreneurs say that, oh, when I'm pitching to an investor, I need to know all the answers. I need to be able to present the business in the best possible light. And I think at the end of the day, like what you were talking about, having that honesty and integrity, that carries it quite a lot further, because oftentimes investors will know if you're lying through your teeth, because they speak to a lot more entrepreneurs. They know your industry, if anything, more than you do sometimes. So having that integrity and honesty, that might actually be more beneficial than actually trying to know everything and trying to be able to sound perfect.
Well, and on that, the bit of advice I had been given, or at least what had been brought to my attention, is that you're going to end up finding the investor who matches that. And if if you try to present yourself as someone else, then you're going to end up finding someone, be it a customer, be it an investor, whoever, or partner in life. Like it's the same thing, right? Who's going to resonate with whatever you've projected there. And if that's not you,
Mm-hmm.
then you're in some trouble later on, unless
Yeah.
again you can somehow figure out a way that you're never dealing with them. But that doesn't, like, for me, like, oh, that's, and there are people who will do that, right? It's this kind of a zero sum game, whatever, I'll take and take.
Mm-hmm.
For me, that certainly wasn't it. So yeah, I think, as you say, long run better. It does sometimes, you feel like it's a limit, and sometimes I think, it needs to be tempered too. Like, I think there is room for optimism. You have to be
Mm-hmm.
excited. You can't, you know, there are things that sometimes you have to play slightly, maybe not quite totally against type,
Yep.
but I think we all can, even just recording yourself and then just kind of. I remember I had someone my first radio interview, I had my person who's helping me with marketing communications. Anyway, she called me afterwards. She's like, "It was a good interview, but you could try sounding excited."
Yeah,
It's like, oh, that's okay. Sure. Thanks. I'll remember that.
for sure. Definitely good points on tempering for sure. Like I say with my podcast as well, like I love my guests to be authentic, but they don't have to be absolutely transparent because maybe some things are not appropriate to share in full disclosure. So definitely understand that. Maybe to move into the fundraising discussion, give us some context on your round. Like when did you start raising? How much did you raise? Where were you in the point of business at the time?
So we've done two raises. We did one, and in total, we've raised privately about 500K. Um, the first one was when we were still in hardware and cross country skiing, so just before a pivot, and then we raised, and then I think it was about a month later we pivoted out of that. Um, that was a bit nerve wracking because, in the sense that, again, you sort of sold an idea to the investors and then you're kind of changing. Now, the reality is that the path we pitched, like, we call it a pivot because we sort of dropped this hardware component entirely and moved out of it. Whereas our plan had always been to get into software. So in a way, it was more like an acceleration of our plan. So in that sense, none of our investors were particularly worried. In fact, if anything, they were kind of happy to see, okay, good, well, you're just moving quicker into where you're going. The next one was when we were firmly in software and had customers and sales coming in. So it was a very different scenario. The first one, again, hardware, we weren't quite in the market we wanted to be in, or even the product entirely. The second one, we were in software, and we were in sort of the Alpine market, and we were wanting to raise investment to really break through into the next big set of markets. In terms of number of investors, we have, it's less than 10. We've been pretty much in the kind of angel territory, so that, in the sense that there's no institutionals on our cap table at this point, and that's been interesting. We certainly spoke to a bunch, but I think there's, which we may get to here,
Great.
there's things of our industry and our business that are, at least the stage that we were raising, we're not maybe as appealing to that investor type.
Mm-hmm. Maybe I'll jump into the definitions in a second, but you talked about the two stages. So one is your pre-pivot round, your pre-pivot funding, and then your post-pivot funding. In the pre-pivot, like how far along were you in the business? Because I think one common question a lot of entrepreneurs get is like, when do I know I'm ready to approach investors? Like, were you in year 2 of the business? Did you have a prototype? Like, how far along were you?
Yeah, we had sold, we had a prototype that we had sold to a few national ski teams. So we had some, um, we had some proof that this thing had some interest.
Mm-hmm.
But it wasn't like, and we sold them for quite a bit considering how much, like, for what the sport was, but it wasn't like, we were like $5,000 as a unit. So, normally, like if we were to get into retail, our plan price for the thing would have been kind of $300. So you can see just the jump,
Yep.
but it wasn't. And we didn't sell a ton of these. It wasn't like we were rolling in money from it, but it was enough to show that there was an interest, and we were able to show that, hey, we can get these sort of influential customers. That helped certainly, because otherwise you just have a neat idea. So I would say, if there's any advice, I'd say like certainly you need to get some sales. You need to have some customers. The in terms of, well, I guess, yeah, that was probably the stage. Like we were around, maybe because it was hardware, it took a little while for us to have something that someone could actually use. So I think we were around for a couple of years. We had sort of been able to exist a bit on our own money being put in, and then there were some government grants too that we were able to leverage. But I would say, software wise, yeah, get it out there, get some sales. Again, prove that that someone's willing to pay for it.
Yeah. So how much do you end up raising in that first round? And maybe you might also allude to, I think you talked to me prior to our call about you did a rolling close, which was a mistake. Like, was that first round the rolling close? Like, if so, how much do you end up raising? How long did it take you to raise that?
I'm trying to remember the details exactly. We did, for both our rounds, we did a rolling close. Now, the advice we'd been given was, no, set a hard date. But the thing is that just the people who we were working with, like the investors we were going after, it just, a hard date works if there's FOMO, a fear of missing out. There's this element of like, oh, okay, this great opportunity is coming and going. But, that works if you're dealing with investors who are seeing deals like in a bunch of different spots, or they're seeing growth. But even if you're seeing growth just skyrocketing, like for an unsophisticated investor, or at least startup investor, like they can be super. And when I say unsophisticated, what I mean there is they're not dumb. They just haven't done this type of investing before. I was an unsophisticated investor start because it was all kind of new to me. So, for them, it's like the concept of, well, you're going to be around next week. Like, do you want my money or not? So this concept of like a hard date, I think, at least with who we were going after initially, was not, it wasn't really pushing them. In terms of the amount, I'd say it was about I think half, or it was about the. Trying to think, it was probably about 200K. Yeah, it was about 200K or so.
Yeah.
It was in terms of that one. Yeah, I wouldn't say actually. In the end, the mechanics of the two raises weren't very much different. We spoke to certainly a lot more people on the second round, because the first round we were pretty like it was hardware, and a lot of people didn't even want to touch us because of hardware. Second round, we had a lot more customers. We had some growth. We talking to a lot more people. We did the second round was when COVID had first hit. So in some ways that was to our benefit, because everyone was in their, home offices. So the fact that we were, as I said in the intro, being based in Whitehorse, Yukon, it didn't make a difference. Like we could have been, down the road on Eglinton in Toronto, and it wouldn't have made a thread of difference to us, because we would have still had to have done it as a Zoom call. So we were pitching, people a lot in Montreal, Vancouver, Toronto, a bunch in Switzerland, because a bunch of our early customers were based in Switzerland. So there was a tie-in to there. But ultimately, almost all of our investors have had some kind of personal-ish type connection. I wouldn't quite call them friends and family, but they were certainly pretty close. And they'd seen kind of what it is I had done in the past. And so it was pretty hard to make that bridge for that external investor.
And out of curiosity, so roughly how long would you say it kind of took from the process of saying, okay, let's go and raise a round, to finally raising enough that we say, okay, we're done with the round ish until maybe the next phase?
Oh yeah, geez. I'd say it was probably 6 months. Like it's nuts. It takes so much longer than you think it's gonna take, and you
Mm,
think like it's up and down, up and down.
yeah.
For one, just prepping everything is tough because you
Mhm.
have, there's your deck, then there's your, and at the deck, like there's version 7,000 by the time you're constantly evolving it and changing it based on what you hear, or just how, as you're doing the pitch, you're hearing people and they're asking questions. You're like, oh my goodness, I really didn't, based on these questions, I'm not getting the story across. Um, we have moments where it's kind of, you get some wins and then you're kind of like, okay, we'll try to go a bit further along here. Uh, but yeah, it was on the second one. I remember we were just like, we were thinking, okay, this isn't, we could just keep, flogging this horse, but it's probably not worth it. And it was a big distraction. In some ways, would it have been better not to do it? I'm not sure. It could have been. That one's a hard one to know. Like, you never know how, like, if you don't do something, you don't know what the impact is, of course, afterwards, but of the other road. But, I do know that we were small. We are small. And
Mhm.
me spending, at least half my time trying to do this raise was half my time, and that's like actually half your time, but then how much of your actual brain, like your bandwidth, is on this other problem.
Yeah.
um, it makes it hard. The business suffered, and it was in a point when we were kind of growing our fastest, and I wasn't able to really be engaged and really kind of push on that, and I think we kind of stalled out. And it was, and it was some ways the raise is, was probably contributed to that, or at least me not being able to be as focused on the growth and trying to like really make sure that we kept building on that.
Yeah, that's a good observation, because I think a lot of people tend to underestimate the effort that goes into fundraising. It's almost having like a second full-time job on the side of being the CEO as well.
Yeah, and it's the highs and lows of it are emotionally taxing.
Hmm.
Um, I think we often hear, I call it like startup porn, this kind of concept of, oh yeah, they went out and raised, and then investors were calling them, and within 6 weeks everything was all signed and finished and off the way. Like, yeah, that wasn't our story, and I don't think that is the case for a lot of people. And I
Hmm.
think even in the 6 weeks, I think it's sometimes can be the classic like overnight success that took 5 years in the making. It's
Yeah.
there could be a lot of seeds planted between then, um, then and when you actually said everything was starting.
Yeah, for sure. And even sometimes like it might have been an entrepreneur that already has relationships with investors, or they've
Hmm.
already started to build out their network. So all of that isn't usually considered in when they talk about the 6 weeks kind of thing. So
Hmm.
um you mentioned unsophisticated investors. Maybe let's talk a bit about that. What would you have done differently? Like what would have made a good kind of maybe let's not use the word unsophisticated, maybe more of a professional investor. What would have been a good professional investor in your round? How would you have done it differently? And do you think that would have made things quicker? Would it have changed the experience coming out of fundraising?
Well, we certainly spoke to, on the second round, especially, we spoke to more of those sort of professional investors, and they were certainly a breath of fresh air. Like, I really did appreciate when someone said, and they would reply relatively quickly saying no, and that was
Mm-hmm.
nice. Um, it's what they say, right? Yes is the best. No is pretty good, and
Mm-hmm.
then no response or waffling is the worst. It's absolutely the worst.
Mm-hmm.
Um, I think for us, I think it was just our network was small, and trying to get access to as many of those professional investors as possible is tough. Um, again, in the realm that we were looking at. So, you're it in that we were introduced to a combo of of professionals and then non-professionals. So people who have money who are looking to do, and they've probably done some startup investing, but those ones, there are always some flags. They're just the questions they may ask. Like how do they, if they ever ask about dividends, you're like,
Mhm.
oh, okay, I don't think you understand how this asset class works. Um, there's things like that, and then they kind of worry you. But sometimes you get desperate, and you're thinking, well, geez, okay, that person's 50,000 is going to be the same as this other person's 50,000, so it'd be nice to get that.
Mhm.
Um, so it's I think on the professional side, like we do have um, I would say, well, we have one very strong investor who's got quite a bit, and they're very active and help us, and they've been with us almost since the beginning.
Mhm.
And I've really enjoyed working with them, and the insight and the amount of time invested in us has been incredible. Um, so that has been good. I think if there were some more of those, it might have been helpful too, because sometimes you need to have that balance of opinion. Um, and so, whereas our current investors, most of the others, just they've never seen the full. They've never, like, this may be one of their first startups, um, and so they haven't seen the whole journey. Uh, so yeah, it would be nice to have a few more for sure.
Yeah. Maybe tell me about how you went about with finding them. You talked about introductions. How do you start to get the ball rolling on those? Did you go to customers for introductions? Did you go to advisors? How did you do that?
Yeah, that's a good point. We went to some customers, certainly. We had and that would have been the most of the stuff coming out of Switzerland was from customers, and I think if we hadn't had COVID, things might have been a bit different. I think what was interesting, as we noticed and this is a bit of an aside, is there's some regional differences too. European investors, um, you know, they really like to invest close, for sure. Like I suspect others, but for them, across the ocean was just too far.
Mhm.
Even quite frankly, if we had been in Switzerland and we're in France, it still probably would have felt a bit far. I think they really like to be really close. Um, so anyway, so that was one. Customers, some from advisors, um, some from there was kind of contacts of ours who put us in touch with other. It was kind of a friend of a friend type
Mhm.
of situation. But I think, to be honest, Jim, that was probably our biggest challenge, was we just could not speak. We couldn't find enough people to talk to, because you have to talk to so many. Um, and you know, again, being based in Whitehorse, there was often you would have, maybe like if you're in Calgary or Vancouver or wherever, there can be a local angel network. So, you'll get some intros that way, and that angel network, those people may have invested, they may be part of another angel network that has a broader reach. So then they may bring in contacts that way. We had a few links outside of Yukon, and then we made the most of that, and we were able to leverage it a bit. But just ultimately, we needed more to be able to speak. I think to be able to speak to more people. Like, it really is just a game of numbers,
Yeah.
for sure.
And related to that note, you know how I feel about pitch events, but I guess a lot of people, when they start the fundraising process, that's their default. They go out to pitch events because they think it's going to give them a lot of exposure to many investors. Did you do any of those? Like, how did you feel the experience was like?
Oh yeah, no, we did. I did some. um, I don't know, but I don't know how many I did in comparison to others, but certainly enough to know that they're a waste of time. I think often, oh, like, it's a circus performance, and you're on stage. Like, you're there, you're the entertainment. And I know it's often these pitch events are put together with, often all the best of intentions for everybody involved. but often the person who's putting on the pitch event, they have to, there's no pitch event unless there's someone up there pitching.
Hmm.
So, and it's you're the sideshow. You're up there and you're the entertainment, and you know, there's a bunch of people having their canapes and wine and kind of half listening to you. It, you know, how many are there active investors are there in the room? Certainly been in some where I'm like, oh, this is mostly bureaucrats or other people who are pitching. I've pitched in at a conference where it's just so loud and people like, yeah, they ultimately end up being popularity contests.
Hmm.
Who has the kind of the best stage performance, and they can be up there. As I said earlier, it's probably not me.
Yeah.
Um, you know, so and and I've pitched in scenarios where like I did one pitch event in Europe where English was the language, and even still, like I feel so bad for the people. Like most people, English was not their first language, and they're having to pitch for this, and I'm like, this is just ridiculous.
Hmm.
But yeah, no, ultimately, I think it's a waste. Like even the scenario of oh well, it'll be practice. You'll be able to kind of practice your pitch, and it'll serve you well for other times when you're pitching an investor.
Hmm.
I think that's bullshit. Like I don't agree, because it ultimately how you deliver it on a stage is totally different than a one-on-one, or even if you had a group of two or three people there. It's a conversation.
Yeah.
You're kind of guiding them through the thing. You're not just standing there going, working your way through the slides.
Mm.
Um, so nah, I learned to just end up avoiding them. It was not, it, it was nothing came out of it for me. And I don't know of any of my peers who had any actual outcomes from them. Like some who had done things like Techstars and such, sure, there's a big pitch event, but they had basically signed up most of their investors before that anyway.
Yeah, no, thanks for saying that. I think it's something that needs to be heard. I definitely agree with you. I think oftentimes it is usually a big waste of time. A pitch event is usually something that lasts on average, about 3 hours. And most of the time, the people in the room, like you mentioned, are other entrepreneurs like yourself trying to pitch. And there's only a handful of investors, and they're not usually the right investors for you as well. Where I do disagree slightly is on the practice side of things, not so much on the presentation practice, but more about I think if you have a good eye and ear to understanding what questions are coming out in the Q&A, that really helps you with kind of tweaking your messaging to understand like what do investors look for. Do they have doubts about certain things? Are they asking a certain answer to hear a no, or because they're challenging your approach? That kind of stuff, but not so much on the presentation. I definitely agree.
Yeah, I agree. Getting feedback is key, and listening to those questions. I think though you can also get that by just trying to pitch individuals
Oh
and
yes.
just get it. And it's not like the pitch event is the only place you're going to get feedback.
Mm-hmm.
So, I would the the presentation and the practice that you need to do for that pitch event
Yeah.
is unique enough, and to me does not warrant the time that if again the goal is to be able to get that feedback. Like I'd say ultimately you
Mm-hmm.
might as well just try to find, and I did that. Like we had gotten introduced, or I'd gotten introduced to a couple investors who you it was right from the beginning. The person introduced said, I'm this isn't probably a company you would invest in,
Mm.
but would you mind listening to them? And that was great because again, it was a scenario where it was still a one-on-one.
Mm.
They certainly asked questions, and yeah, it was low stress in the sense that we pretty much knew they weren't going to invest. They knew they weren't going to invest because they probably were later stage. Like at one point, I think I pitched someone from Omer's.
Yeah.
Like, they're not, they're, like we're not even close. But it was neat. It was neat what his perspective and some of the stuff he had said. Like I remember we were like even our pitch, like we were talking a lot about sort of our exit strategy in terms of through acquisition, and this is who we're looking at, and so on. And I remember the feedback we had gotten was, if you're going to pitch institutions like us in the future, just so you know, it shouldn't be a you're going to get acquired scenario. It should be we're going to grow so big, we're going to acquire these guys.
Mm.
And so it's, and I was like, oh, okay, well, that that maybe not exactly how we see it going at this point, but okay, it's good to know. But anyway, that was helpful to know. Like, and the person was, they had enough knowledge of the industry to know that who we were likely pitching, we're not looking for that, but
Yep.
just giving us enough of a heads up of being like, okay, as you evolve and as you grow, be aware that you may have to change what you're talking about here.
Yeah, for sure. No, that's a very, very good point. That the time that you put into those events, maybe much better to just spend a 1 hour one-on-one meeting and then get some good quality introductions from there. Interesting. Maybe let's talk a bit about the pivot piece because in our pre-call before the interview, you talked a bit about being in a very small and unique space that might not be as appealing to many investors. Tell me about kind of the walkthrough on what made you decide to do the pivot and kind of as you pivoted, like what opened up for you?
Yeah. So being, targeting cross country skiing and hardware, it was I remember reading a book. It's actually Chaos Monkeys, which is, aside from he's not exactly the author is not he's not well loved, certainly, and there's a lot of not great things in that book. But what he did talk about was he said a startup is basically a miracle. You're hoping a miracle is going to happen, and if you look at your startup and you need more than one miracle to happen, like if you're a 2 or 3 miracle
Mhm.
startup, then it's the chances of your success is going to be very, very low. The other way I'd look at it too, sometimes like a bank shot, like in pool, like you can, if you have to only hit off one bank off of one of the walls or edges, I don't play pool, whatever, then it's doable. But if you have to start hitting like three for it, to get the ball, anyway, in our first market, that's what we were in. We were in a scenario where we had multiple miracles that had to work. And it was pretty obvious to us pretty quickly that to be able to pull this off, we need a lot of money. And as we finished that round, we realized this is like we're at the highest point. Like we to be able to get to the next, we'll do another round with this technology, we would have to show a bunch of growth. But be able to get a bunch of growth, we need a ton of money. So really almost came down to we just didn't have enough money to be able to take it as far as that that technology needed. So in some ways, the decision was kind of made for us then. The it was emotionally quite hard, even though again we were pitching this idea of okay, hey, we're going to start in this hardware in this sport. We're going to evolve our software to work with our hardware, and it happens that this sport people do these other sports which are way larger. So that was kind of the concept, was this bridging, was the thought that okay, people are already using our software, now we'll just keep selling to them, say instead of just using it in the winter, now you can use it in the summer, and then hey, tell your friends, and then grow from there. So in the end, we just ended up jumping straight into the software side of things and basically going, okay, that is one roundabout way to acquire customers in a rather expensive way. So let's just try to build the software tool and then acquire customers in maybe a more traditional sense, which is selling the software rather than a piece of hardware, and then pivoting and then kind of growing out the other portion of the business.
Yeah.
Um,
I'm curious how did the team react to that pivot? Because I believe maybe in some cases, like maybe some of your early team members might be, oh, we got into this because we were personally really excited about alpine skiing and what this could do for alpine skiing. Did you find that there was a lot of pushback from the team? Was there a loss of momentum there?
Well, the first one was cross country skiing, and then we actually moved into alpine. So believe
Oh,
it or
sorry.
not,
Mhm.
they are actually quite a bit different, even though they're still skiing.
Mhm.
And yeah, you're right. Like when we started, there was some of our early team members were very much into cross country. Now, I think they saw it too. It's like okay, the chances of us really making a big go of this. And it's funny, like 2 years later, we were looking at some stuff, and would have occasionally someone might, with one of the prototypes might use it, and we were like, well, it was actually really good. It was really good tech we had made, and it was just a shame that it just never really made it. But ultimately, it was. I was nervous when I was, presenting this to my staff, saying this is where we're going to move to, but ultimately they understood. Like as I say, it was pretty clear. It wasn't like anyone was going, no, 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 this is the future. Our options are going to be worth so much if we stay here. So no, that was fine. Thankfully, other than again the emotional aspect of you saw a path, you were kind of invested in a path, and you realize that path's just not going to pay out. So you have to change your. So I think maybe our pivot was, I'd say it was probably pretty quick. It could have been quicker. I think we could have been a little less invested in some of our old tech, and I think some of it it took a while, a few gremlins in the system, in the software based on the old tech.
Yeah.
That it might have been better to just sort of nuke and pave, try and build out from scratch. But I think that you never really know that until you're far down the tech debt kind of side. And you realize, oh shit, wait, we should have really just started fresh.
And since you're talking about fundraising, I'm curious to hear about the investor influence around the pivot. Was there a lot of pushback, or like you mentioned, was it more like the investors actually encouraged the pivot? Like, how did it go?
Well, our largest and our most, or I'd say the professional investor, they were the ones who really kind of they kind of I wouldn't say they told us. Often they're good. We have good weekly discussions, and it was kind of in one of those where it was like, that there's just not, the future is just not going to be there. And so that's when there was kind of this moment of figuring, okay, we're going to have to change something. So they were the ones who did that initial push. So that was the biggest investor. So that was easy in that sense. We didn't have to sell them. If anything, they were kind of trying to push us. The other investors, I'd say all of them were like, in the end, ultimately, we've invested in you. We've invested in what we think you can accomplish. Granted, what you're saying you're going to do is not massively different than what you said you were going to do before you took our money. It's maybe a bit of a jump. There was one investor who felt like there was, I think he overestimated the value of the IP that we had made. And I think that's how he made his decision to invest, saying, okay, well, at the very least, there's this piece of hardware that could be sold and could recoup costs. The reality is just no one's going to buy a 75% done piece of hardware. I have to trust the direction. So it wasn't too bad, thankfully.
Okay, good to know. Cool. You alluded to this big main investor. Would you call him your quote unquote lead investor, or like what would you say his role is in kind of in your cap table?
Yeah, it's definitely lead. He sits on our board, so I'd say like I worked with him. Like he kind of was advising me for almost a year before investing. So, he saw sort of what we could accomplish and everything. So, we've known each other now for pretty much the entire time that Proskida has been running. But yeah, so he's been great. It's like a marriage. I think, that's the one thing they say about investors too, is that you can, if you look at founders and investors, you can survive a bad founder relationship, but it's very hard to survive a bad investor relationship. And this one has been good. There's certainly, as probably like most relationships, it hasn't been always easy or fun. But again, on that whole sort of mutual respect, integrity side of things, they align very well with me, and they're up front, and it's been a good one. So that's, if there's any bit of advice I could pass on is really make sure that this individual, you get them. Like if there's any bits where you're like, you're just not sure about them. Like we had one investor who, or this potential investor who we got an intro who's quite large in the world of sport, world renowned, and we pitched the person and so on, and ultimately this person ended up passing, which ultimately we ended up finding out was probably a good thing, because whenever like their persona in in when they were in sport was that they were a massive asshole, like they were the biggest asshole ever, and apparently that wasn't that was apparently true to form, I think, is what we had what we had heard even from the person who introduced us. So ultimately, I guess what I'm saying is that we could have taken on an investor who probably would have brought in a lot of money, a lot of influence in the sports that we were going into, but it would have been like selling our souls to the devil, I think,
Yeah.
in the sense that that relationship would have not been the one that we would have wanted to, or it just wouldn't have matched with
Yeah.
us. So it was I think, but it's tough. Like at the same time, you're like, oh, if we have this person on our cap table, we'll be able to do so much. I'll be able to handle those problems. But I
Hmm.
think those are the ones that can kind of, they can hurt. Like if the business isn't going great and you've got someone, like not only are you trying to manage a business and dealing with cash flow and dealing with employees and turnover or whatever, that's going on, customers, and then you have on top of that an investor who just doesn't line up with you, personally, who's berating you on the phone, that is not helpful. So ultimately, you know, go with someone who you have that there's a connection. You feel that connection. You think that, okay, this is someone who for the next few years I can see working with, and if I have to tell them bad news, we're going to work it out together.
Yeah.
And similarly, they can tell you bad news. So yeah,
No,
that was a good one. Yeah.
that's good to hear, and I'll add to that. Even actually going ahead and doing due diligence on your investors. A lot of entrepreneurs, they obviously the investors are the ones that are doing due diligence on them, doing their background checks, the research. But entrepreneurs can also do that to their investors. Speak to other investors, speak to other entrepreneurs that they've invested in, and kind of get their take. Like, is this going to be a good investor, or how has he been to work with? That kind of stuff.
Oh yeah, but it's
Yeah.
hard. It's hard.
Mm-hmm.
Like that's the thing, Chin, because I think the thing is I don't think I would suspect most entrepreneurs were in a similar situation to us where
Mm.
don't have an excess number of checks coming in.
True.
Whereas I think as an investor, it's the opposite. You almost always have more opportunities to invest than you do money. So it does make it a little bit easier. It's a way, the due diligence is a way to filter it out. Whereas as an entrepreneur, even though like everything I just said, I'm sure anybody's listening to this going, oh, of course, of course. But
Mm-hmm.
then when someone says, yeah, okay, I'm willing to invest, and yeah, man, I'll take whatever 200K,
Mm-hmm.
and then you find out, oh, they may not be the best person. You start thinking, well, yeah, but maybe I can deal with that. It's really hard to say no and hard to move on. And anyway, that's the bit of advice I gotten from our lead investor was wait till they say they want to invest before you make your final decision. Because that's the other thing too. You can fret and mow and all of this about what the personality is, but
Yep.
until they say they're going to invest, it's a non-issue.
Mm-hmm.
So for us, we pitched this person, and and in the end they passed, so we didn't have to make that decision. So
Good.
that was good.
Yeah.
Saved
No,
us.
definitely agree. There are a lot of compromises that come with coming from a position of scarcity.
Yes.
Yeah. But yeah, you're right. Like, don't waste time doing due diligence if they're not even interested in you to begin with. Um, I'm curious on the lead investor piece, because there is this big myth that you have to ideally find a lead investor in order to successfully close your round. And I think I've seen actually a lot of rounds come and go where entrepreneurs close without any formal lead investor. Does your lead investor call himself a lead investor or herself? Do they identify as the lead?
Um, they led both our rounds, I think, in the sense that we negotiated. So the way we did our rounds were they were priced rounds
Mm-hmm.
with So we weren't doing a safe or convertible note or anything like that. So ultimately, we negotiated the term sheet with them, and then that term sheet we presented to others later on. So that was, in the sense, it was like that we had that lead investor. Was it absolutely required? No, not at least with who we were dealing with, because I think often with a lead investor is that then they'll kind of go and they'll find a bunch of people with you, and they'll kind of bring in a bunch, and that wasn't the case. Really, ultimately, it was just, we just had someone to negotiate this term sheet with, which in reality, we could have just put something together. And people weren't, we had some people who didn't like some of the terms, but they were kind of, well, we did common shares. So, rather than preferred and all of that, and we weren't going to change that. So it wasn't like it was one little thing on the term sheet we could change.
Yep.
So in the end, it was like, okay, well, they're not going to be in. So, and I guess what we did have, though, is we had the confidence that this at least had passed the muster of our biggest investors so far. Because, whatever, I can write whatever I want in a term sheet. But then if people start questioning the terms, you start to question, okay, is this reasonable? Or have I actually done something kind of it's not going to make this an easy sell? Whereas I could come back saying, well, ultimately we have our lead they're okay with it. But no, I don't think you need to. I think our first round could have been a lot quicker if we hadn't bothered with the lead and just wrote out a kind of term sheet and been like, here you go. Yeah, I wouldn't say you absolutely have to go that route.
Good to know. And to kind of add some value on that piece, then what I normally find is, in terms of lead investors, most entrepreneurs, the lead is more of a internal term that they use to describe their own main investor, or at least who they see as the main one in the round. And I've seen companies where, checks have been signed, like paperwork has been like dotted and signed off as well. And then later on, they bring on a really notable investor that they really want in the round. And the notable investor doesn't like the paperwork and terms. And they go back to all their existing investors and they tear out all the paperwork and say, hey, we have this bigger investor who's coming in now. They would like to switch to these better terms. And here's why it might be of interest to you to continue on in the round with these better terms. Maybe it's better for them. Maybe it makes more sense for the business. And I've seen paperwork change overnight in the case as well. So don't think that if you've signed everything, if you've cashed your checks, that's the end of the road, and you have to stick to those terms.
Yeah, I'd agree. I've heard similar situations as well. I think it's more costly on the lawyer's side, and it also has to be worth it, right? Like, because that's, I think the other thing is, one of the benefits of coming in with a term sheet already is that you can be like, hey, these are the terms, let's just move on, rather than, okay, we're reopening this door. Now, if they actually follow through and they come in and they're coming in with more money than the others, then yeah, it's going to be worth your while. The problem is you never really know that until, again, you get the check. And I think that can be a challenge, is you just, like, we had some who we thought we were so close to closing. And we're like, we can't see any reason why this wouldn't happen. And then it didn't happen. Yeah. So it's, and it goes to our earlier point of just how much of a time suck it is. Like, I suspect for each of those situations, there may have been 2 or 3 where they went close to finishing that, that same road, and nothing panned out. So it's tough. Like, I think ultimately, until you have their check, no matter what they say, you can't, like, things will change. Things can change.
Well, good to know. I think we're ending, kind of drawing onto the end of the episode. A lot of really good insights here. So maybe what I like to try to do is to summarize it and then to kind of tease out or untangle some of the pieces in there. So feel free to jump in if you're hearing anything that's interesting that I'm going to be talking about. So at least what I was hearing from your experience, you talked a bit about the journey of going through the process of fundraising, raising from quote unquote unsophisticated investors and doing a rolling close. And in turn, some of how it ended up possibly drawing out your round a bit longer than you would like it to be. And making it a bit more taxing on you as the founder as well. So that it was distracting for the business. So all really good points. We talked a bit about the mythical lead investor. We talked about, you know, raising from the right align or value aligned investors who share the same kind of perspective that you do in terms of honesty, integrity, respect. So yeah, all really, really good points. Some verbiage or jargon that was used in today's episode. So we talked a bit about angels, VCs. For listeners who are not familiar, angels are what we call accredited investors, and the unsophisticated versus sophisticated or professional. The main difference there is usually, you know, if you're a doctor, if you're making above a certain level of income, you could technically qualify as an angel investor. But whether or not you're actively in the game of investing in startups, that kind of distinguishes you between, you know, being a professional or sophisticated versus an unsophisticated investor. So usually it's a bit easier to go after investors who have some experience around investing because they know what to expect. They know what paperwork kind of looks like. You know, they're not going to ask for dividends when obviously they know this company is not ready to issue dividends anytime soon. So it's just managing that expectations a bit easier with a professional investor. And I think there are also traits that make up what we call an ideal investor as well. All things that I learned from my mentor, Keith, at Spring, definitely not something that I know myself, but the 7 things that he talks about in an ideal investor is, number 1, are your investors value and return aligned? So do they share the same value as you? Do they care about the same things? Do they have the same mission? And then number 2, return aligned as well. Like if your investor is the type that is expecting a 5-year return at 10x, then if you're trying to, on the other hand, do a very different kind of business where you want to exit and sell the business as an acquisition, maybe they're not the right fit, right? And then you talked about geographic relevance, like investors, are they close to you, or perhaps, you know, maybe are they close to your customers or the market that you're trying to penetrate? The third one is network. Does your investor have a good network of maybe other potential investors, or maybe potential partners or customers? The fourth one would be industry experience. Are they familiar with your space? The fifth one is subject matter expertise. Can they add other value? Maybe they're a sales or marketing expert. Maybe they're a hardware person. Maybe they know more about certain things that you lack experience in. And then the sixth one is business model experience. Are they familiar with the type of business model that you're using? Perhaps you're using let's say a subscription-based model with your software, or you're using usage-based pricing. If they know more around the type of business model, they might be able to give you some insight around how to approach it, how to sell to customers, how to actually, you know, get the decision makers through the door. And lastly, like, are they easy to work with? Like, what's your involvement expectation? Are they an active investor? Do you want them to be active? Do you want them to be more passive? That kind of stuff. So yeah, those are some traits of an ideal investor. On the lead investor piece that we talked about, oftentimes what I find is there is some merit to having kind of that social proof there, because you talked about FOMO, fear of missing out. And oftentimes you don't necessarily need like a main lead investor. I think at the end of the day, oftentimes a lot of investors will hear from, a lot of entrepreneurs will hear from other investors, and the investors will ask, like, who's your lead? Who's your lead? And at the end of the day, you just need to tell them, like, hey, these are the people who are at the table and are interested. And if they can see that other people are showing interest in your business, that helps kind of get them across the line as well. So yeah, that's one piece on the lead investor piece. So yeah, I think some really good insights. There's a lot more we could talk about, but maybe let's wrap it up here.